number of developers is absolutely in China. And not to put my U.S. flag on Silicon Valley, as you well know, it's really, really expensive. Engineers are engineers. I never want to go back. So Sonatype started out focusing a lot of energy on Maven. And Maven basically democratized the use of open source, made it very easy to reuse Java open source components. Since that time, you've seen things like NPM and NuGet and PyPy and Docker and Go more recently. It's a lot easier now to use somebody else's software. All these things like Maven, basically turned open source into building blocks. And so that's where we started. And as a result of the work that we did in Maven, we realized that Maven downloads a lot. And so necessity being the mother of invention, we ultimately created the Nexus Repository Manager, development tool that basically cached components locally and also allowed you to store the results of your builds and distribute them as part of release automation, continuous delivery, continuous integration, so on and so forth. So I think that the common theme between those two things is how do we help the world develop better software even faster? And then the interesting thing is as the world kind of started using more and more open source, it became basically an outsourcing model. And so companies started outsourcing their technology stack for a vast majority of their applications to the open source ecosystem. But they really didn't think about it in terms of that outsourcing relationship. They said, hey, we have all this free software. A lot of people are looking at it. The quality must be good, no problem. And in many respects, the quality is good. But if you're not, depending on where the eyeballs are looking, you might miss things like security vulnerabilities. Not only that, I think there's so much open source being used. The communications channels didn't emerge that made it very easy to understand when a new vulnerability is out there, that I'm using it and I need to take action as a result of that. So basically the change in the way that the world started developing software, packaging a lot of this open source, created an opportunity for Sonatype to offer more value around that. So, and again, I'd argue it's still in line with better software faster. In this particular case, better, safer software faster, I guess. So that's what Sonatype does currently. Two major products, the Nexus Repository Manager and another product called Nexus Lifecycle. And then we have other products that go between them. So we have something called Nexus Firewall, which is like a network firewall, but it guards your repository manager, preventing malicious components from being ingested and keeping them out of your software development process altogether. So that's in a quick elevator pitch version what Sonatype does. I can't talk about exact numbers. That stuff is confidential information, but we'll certainly be at IPO scale in the next year and a half to 2 years. Whether we go IPO, it's hard to say what happens. There could be a strategic acquirer comes along and takes us out before we do that. But I think the most important thing is not to really focus on the IPO, but to focus on the market and serving the customers in that market overall. If we are very good at delivering more and more value into the market, everything else just tends to work out. We have 120 people on the R&D side, and then we have a data research team composed of another 40 and a customer support team. So collectively, if you step back, the way we're organized is our product organization includes anything that services, supports, designs, develops, the product management aspects. All of that rolls up into a single product organization overall. I think it's worked really well for us. Everybody in that organization is working remotely. The background that you see here is in my home and in Northern Virginia, but we have people ranging from Germany, the UK, to Canada, United States, and Colombia. So I don't get credit for the decision. I would credit Brian Fox, the CTO, and the other founder, Jason Van Zyl, who was also the founder of the Apache Maven project, one of the original founders of Sonatype. Back in 2007, before Sonatype was even created, they were doing a lot of open source work. with respect to Maven. And so then they commercialized it, but a lot of the contributors to Maven ended up coming on board and being part of Sonatype, and some of those people are still with us to this day. And so it was basically, well, we're already doing a lot of open source development. Sonatype in the very early days didn't know what it wanted to be when it grew up. It didn't know what market it was actually going to go after. A lot of it surrounded Maven, so it made sense. Hey, open source is already developed remotely. Why don't we continue this model and develop remote? So, you know, it basically, we started down that path of remote in 2007. I joined Sonatype in 2011, so about 4 years after. And again, I think the company was incorporated in 2008. So when I came aboard, there was 12 people in engineering, all of which were working remotely. And I had no idea how that worked. I've done open source development before I understood how the open source model worked. I didn't understand how remote development worked in a corporate kind of commercial development context. Probably the biggest one is the unlimited pool of talent that we have access to. So if Sonatype is headquartered in basically Columbia, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. area, if we had to scale and attract development talent and we were limited to the DC area, there's a lot of competition. The prices are a lot higher, but the skills that you get, I mean, there's a lot of software development going on in DC, but ultimately, if you step back and you say, if we're going to go remote and we're going to have the US and Canada, in the UK, which are our primary areas of recruiting, and most recently we went into South America, Colombia in particular, that recruiting geography is more than 1,000 times bigger in terms of the opportunity for people. And basically, at our scale, it's an infinite recruiting geography. So it doesn't make recruiting great software engineers easier. That's always a difficult task. You have to be incredibly discerning to hire great software engineers. But I can't imagine trying to do the same thing and being restricted to people that would be willing to work in, say, Columbia, Maryland. I mean, there are plenty of great people up there, but it's so vastly limited compared to what we can do with the remote construct that we have. We also have a number of people in the UK and a very small presence in Germany. Now, the company also has people in, say, Singapore and Australia and other places. We don't have product development efforts there. I think it's very important. There's nothing wrong with being remote, but you do need to have some time zone overlap. And you can't, you know, to say have a presence in China from an R&D perspective. At the current scale that we're operating and the collaboration that we need to have organizationally, I don't think that would work. In fact, I know it would be very, very difficult. It has an enormous amount of overlap with the U.S. time zones. A lot of we look to overlap mostly around the U.S. Eastern time zone, not because our headquarters is there, but it's just because it's kind of the midpoint between. We have somebody in Alaska, you know, going all the way over to Germany, and that tends to be a good place. So Colombia was interesting for a few reasons. Price is certainly important. I mean, if you can hire phenomenal engineering expertise and you can do it for a lower price and you're not compromising on your ability to work effectively, then why would you not do that, right? So it's not that it's just about the money. There's a ton of engineering talent. The biggest source of engineering talent in the world is, I would think, in the U.S. I know that Russia has a lot of great engineering talent in Ukraine and other places like that. Silicon Valley, as you well know, it's really, really expensive, and there's a ton of competition, and it's really hard to keep people, and there's all kinds of challenges with that. The remote model, I think if you're compensating people appropriately and fairly, the lack of a commute and offering people a lot of engaging work and interesting challenges technically leads to, really good numbers in terms of retention. So our, and knock on wood, but our annual retention tends to be around, let's just say it's north of 95% and has been over the 7.5 years I've been at Sonatype. So in an industry which is probably typically seeing about 20% attrition a year or 80% retention, we're doing 4 times better. The Columbia effort is new. That initiative started at the end of last year. The first people that we hired from Columbia was in November. But no, so in some sense, I said, there's some risk here. Maybe we don't understand culturally how they work. But I will say one thing. Having worked with people from all around the world, literally just about every country that does any kind of major technology development, engineers are engineers. It does. I mean, there are cultural differences, but those tend to evaporate when you get in and you start working on interesting problems and develop software together. So there have been no clashes whatsoever. I mean, people value different things. There's no question about that. And we do, as part of our recruiting process, we kind of implicitly select for the kinds of values that we think are important for us. They're not specifically called out and, put on a poster on the wall. I think that stuff's nonsense, but we do select for cultural compatibility as part of that process. That said, that hasn't been an issue in any of the geographies that we've recruited, and I think that ultimately comes back to, engineers just want to write great software, or great engineers certainly want to write great software. Certainly, Columbia is a bit of an emerging market, although there are a number of companies, Apple, and I think Globant is one of the big IT consulting companies that, there's a lot of companies in the U.S. that ultimately are getting labor from Columbia. And so I think from an economic standpoint, Columbia is looking at it and say, hey, we can provide, development services for the U.S. and that market's kind of growing. But people are also starting to become aware that, hey, we can actually earn a reasonable amount of money. And I think there was a survey done on a site that showed, that typical developers in Columbia were in the top 1% earners in the entire country. Sorry. So I mean, it's for them. They can live a very good lifestyle, and at the same time, it's at a competitive wage from a U.S. perspective. But so back to your recruiting question, how do we do that? Because Sonatype, early on, Sonatype was not really well known. It's interesting that you say, I've never heard of Sonatype. A lot of people say that. A lot of people do know the Nexus repository. Developers tend to know that. And then when we say, what does Sonatype do? Well, we have the Nexus repository. Oh, you're the guys that do Nexus. Okay, gotcha. So the Nexus brand is a little bit more out there than the Sonatype brand, but that brand presence is starting to grow, and I think word is starting to spread. I'm going to a conference in Bogota next month, a DevOps conference, where I'll be speaking about what we're doing. But I mean, our tooling is used by millions of developers every day. Our tooling and services overall, and for an opportunity for developers to work on something used by millions of people that people get a ton of value from, that's interesting work. And so I think it's a bit of a marketing challenge, helping people understand that there's a real opportunity here is there. But I think it's kind of the emergent market of development expertise in Columbia, combined with the growing market presence of Sonatype, combined with proactive marketing that we do in country, attending conferences. We have a recruiter that's based in Colombia, in Bogota, that is reaching out to people. But then there's also LinkedIn, which has been a huge source of recruiting. Well, we'll go out and we'll scour LinkedIn and look for people and proactively contact them. And I think I've mentioned when we had talked before, using Stack Overflow. There are targeted ads on Stack Overflow that work. So it's a number of different channels that we use to connect. And we've started to see pretty good resume flow at this point. There's a lot of filtering that goes on, as you would expect in any recruiting process, but that's basically how we do it. Well, it's definitely not a huge deal. It's absolutely not impossible because we're doing it, and we're still a relatively small company. We have like 350 people growing to 400 something this year. So, but we had people in the U.S. and Canada and the UK when we were less than 100 people as a company. And there are differences in the laws, but there are also other firms out there that can help you. Like we have payroll providers that we work with. Now, I will freely admit, I trivialized what it takes to do that, and my CFO, Dave Miller, reminds me, this stuff is not trivial. It takes a long time to set up, and but it can absolutely be done, and a lot of companies are starting to do remote work now. So this is a solved problem without a doubt. There are some complexities, and there's a little bit of incremental overhead in managing multiple payroll providers and whatnot. But I think the benefits that you get from that model, the access to greater talent, the more economical wages that are possible in that model, and other benefits all greatly outweigh the difficulties of setting up that structure. You have a hybrid model. You have to fix that immediately. If you have a combination of co-located and remote, you're going to be in trouble pretty completely different. So I completely disagree, categorically disagree. That is intuitive, and certain problems can be solved better face-to-face, but not all problems. And actually, so that is the biggest reason people, criticize the remote model. It's also a fallacy. Never. With one caveat. I don't want to have a local R&D center because I think that introduces the dangers of the hybrid model, the combination of co-located and remote. However, we are going to have an R&D center that is focused on complementing and supporting our remote workforce. So we're going to have a place where when teams need to get together and collaborate for short periods, like kicking off a new initiative for whatnot, or doing product discovery and other elements like that, or engaging with customers potentially, we're building an R&D center, and I think it's going to be in the Columbia area. We'll see where it ultimately is, but it's not a place for local development. It's a place for the remote people to come together in for a brief period, and then they go back to the remote model overall. Don't know that I would differentiate between a remote employee and somebody who comes into the office every day. Anybody can learn how to work remotely. If they're a good developer, if they're good at working in the team sport nature of development, anybody can do that. So the ideal remote developer is effectively the ideal developer. I wouldn't even use a distinction there. Sure. I mean, and not to be self-serving, my LinkedIn profile has, I think it's the magic of the remote organization is the title of the post. That has a lot of what we've talked about in here with a little more detail in some areas. I think that would be helpful. The guys that I believe it was Basecamp wrote a book. I think it's just called Remote.
Yeah.
And that is definitely worth a read. There are undoubtedly some other posts out there. The thing I would avoid, one thing that is worth researching is understanding when remote has failed. And I don't know if there are a lot of articles out of there, but implicitly, where I see remote failure, it is almost always the combination of the local and remote together and just not working out. And there's nothing wrong with having some for example, our company is actually a hybrid, but it's not a hybrid in a discipline within a disciplinary boundary. Our product organization is fully remote. Our marketing team is pretty much all together in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, and our finance team is all based in Columbia, Maryland. So they are on site and local, but those disciplines are local. But when the engineering discipline, that's entirely remote. You don't want to mix modes within a single discipline. I never want to go back. But that said, I don't mind going to the office, and there are times where I go to the office about once a week. We have our Monday management meetings with the rest of the executive team. So that makes sense. So I have a remote organization that I support, but I also work with the executive team, so I do need to get together. Do I want to go back to a model of going to the office every day? There's only one possible situation where I would do that. When you are just starting out a company, I do think that getting people together and spending a lot of time together early on is important. But once you figure out what it is, what problems you need to solve, and how you're going to go after the market, I think you can then start to migrate to the remote model and get all the benefits the remote model has to offer. So I wouldn't mind going back to the office if it was to start another startup. Of course, I'm getting a little old here, so I don't know how many years I have left and if my heart can take another startup, but I imagine it could. And frankly, I love that idea of creating something from nothing.